I've always believed that houses hold memories the same way people do. Some memories sit right on the surface, easy to see and easy to touch. Others are buried deep, sealed away under layers of paint, drywall, or time. And every once in a while, if you're in the right place at the right moment, the house lets something slip, something it kept quiet for decades, something it wants someone, anyone, to finally notice. I didn't expect my house in southern Ohio to be one of those places. When I bought it, it looked like any other 1950s single-story home on a quiet street where the biggest excitement was deciding which neighbor's dog had been digging up which lawn. It had beige siding, cracked concrete steps, and a roof desperately in need of updating. Nothing about it said mystery or hidden past. It just looked tired, old, ordinary. But maybe that was the first sign there was more to it. Before I start, I want to ask you something. When you move into an old house, do you ever wonder who lived there before you? Not the names on the deed, not the tax records, but the real people. The ones who laughed in the kitchen, who cried in the bedroom, who argued in the hallway, who paced the floors late at night thinking about the decisions that shaped their lives. Have you ever thought about how much of them remains, tucked into the corners where nobody looks? If you have, tell me in the comments, and let me know where you're listening from. What state, what town, what kind of houses you grew up in. I love knowing where these stories travel and who they land with. Anyway, all of this started on a cold February afternoon 2 years ago. The kind of afternoon where you can see your breath inside the house because the insulation is older than you are. I'd moved in 3 months earlier, and the place needed more work than the home inspector had politely hinted. The floorboards creaked, the windows leaked, the paint peeled if you breathed too hard near it. I wasn't planning on doing a full renovation. I didn't have the budget, but I figured I could at least redo the floors myself. I started in the primary bedroom, where the floor had a subtle dip in the middle. Nothing big enough to be alarming, just enough to make you feel like the room had a secret. I removed the old carpet, expecting to find typical 1950s hardwood underneath. And I did. Sort of. The boards were uneven, stained in strange shapes, and warped like they'd seen more moisture than a bedroom floor should ever see. One board near the wall sounded different when I stepped on it, hollow, like it wasn't sitting on a joist. At first, I thought it was loose. But when I knelt down, pressed my palm against the wood, and knocked on it lightly, it made a dull sound that didn't match the boards around it. Old houses do this. But something about the sound made my skin tighten a little. I pried carefully at the edge of the board with a crowbar. The nails were old, rusted, almost fused into the wood. When the board finally lifted, dust puffed into the air like a breath held too long. Beneath it was a shallow cavity about 2 feet long and a foot wide, lined with crumbling newspapers from the early 1960s. And in the center of that cavity sat a metal box. It was small, maybe the size of a lunch tin. The paint was chipped and peeling. The latch was rusted shut. But the moment I saw it, something inside me shifted. There was no logical reason for it, but I felt like I wasn't supposed to find it. Or maybe I was. But not like this. Not while wearing paint-stained sweatpants and work gloves with holes in the fingertips. I picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. Something rumbled inside when I tilted it gently. For a moment, I just sat there on the floor, holding the box like it might explain itself if I squeezed hard enough. The house felt quieter than it had all winter, like it was listening. I carried the box to the kitchen table and set it down. The metal felt cold, even in the warm light of the room. I stared at it for a long time before I found a flathead screwdriver and worked the edge beneath the latch. It didn't open easily. I had to put real force into it, twisting until the rust gave way with a small snap. Inside, wrapped in faded blue cloth, were 3 things: a set of medals, a folded paper sealed with brittle wax, and a black and white photograph. I lifted the medals first. They were military, heavy, tarnished with age, a Purple Heart, a bronze star, and a service medal from World War II. The ribbons were faded, the colors dulled. I turned them over carefully, but found no engraving, no initials, no identifying details. Next, the paper. The wax seal cracked the moment I unfolded it. Inside was a handwritten letter, creased and worn. The ink had bled in places, and the handwriting leaned sharply to the right, rushed and emotional. The letter wasn't long, but every line carried weight. It spoke of regret, of something left unfinished, of someone waiting, someone the writer wasn't sure they'd ever see again. But the strangest, most haunting part was the way it ended, with a single sentence that made the back of my neck prickle. "If you ever find this, tell her I kept my promise." There was no name, no date, no address. Finally, the photograph. It showed a young woman standing beside a tree in what looked like a small backyard. Her hair was curled in the style of the late 1940s. She wore a light summer dress. Her eyes were focused on something past the camera, as if the person taking the photograph had said her name just as they pressed the shutter. She wasn't smiling, but she didn't look sad either. She looked expectant. On the back of the photo, in the same sharp handwriting as the letter, was one word: Evelyn. I sat there with the photograph in my hand, feeling like I'd just stepped into someone else's unfinished story. The house felt different now, less like a building, more like a witness. And something inside me felt compelled, almost obligated, to understand what I'd found. You ever get that feeling? That the universe places something in your path, and you can either step over it and pretend you didn't see it, or you can pick it up and find out why it was there. If you've ever had that experience, finding something in a home, a letter, an old picture, anything that felt like a call to dig deeper, tell me in the comments. I'm always curious how many stories start the way mine did. I didn't know it then, but opening that box started a chain of events that would take me across Ohio, into county archives, through conversations with strangers who knew more than they wanted to admit, and finally into the life of a woman whose name had almost been erased from history. But before any of that, I needed to answer a simple question. Who was Evelyn? And why had someone hidden the truth of her story under the floorboards of my bedroom? I sat with the box for nearly an hour before I could bring myself to touch it again. The light in the kitchen shifted as the afternoon sun moved across the sky, and the metal surface warmed under my fingertips. The house felt quiet in a way that didn't feel empty, more like it was waiting for what I'd do next. I'd only lived there a few months, but that moment made me feel like I'd finally been invited into its secrets. I carried the photograph to the living room, held it under the lamp, and studied every detail. The woman, Evelyn, stood with her hands folded loosely in front of her. She looked like she was in her mid-20s. The background was simple. An oak tree, a sliver of white siding behind her, the faint outline of a chain-link fence. It could have been anywhere in the Midwest. But something about her expression struck me. It wasn't posed. It wasn't stiff like some old photographs. She looked alive, caught between anticipation and uncertainty, like she was waiting for someone who might or might not show up. The handwriting on the back felt hurried, emotional, personal. Whoever wrote it had known her well enough to call her by her first name without any explanation. And the letter in the box felt like it came from the same hand. I carefully unfolded the brittle paper again. The writing was sharp, right-leaning, almost impatient. The words spoke of a promise kept, of wanting forgiveness, of something unfinished, but it never said what that unfinished thing was, or who the letter was for. I tried to imagine the scene. Someone kneeling over the open floor, lowering the box into the cavity. Someone sealing it away, pressing the floorboard back into place, maybe in the middle of the night, maybe trembling, maybe certain that no one would ever find it. Was it hidden to protect someone, or to hide guilt? There were too many questions for one night. I put everything back in the box and slid it under my bed. But I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the furnace struggle against the February cold, thinking about the woman in the photograph and the man who'd written the letter. Their lives suddenly felt closer to mine than they should have. The next morning, I drove to the County Historical Society. It was housed in an old brick building downtown, sandwiched between a barber shop that hadn't updated its sign since 1978 and a bakery that always smelled like cinnamon rolls. Inside the Historical Society, the air felt still, thick with the scent of old books and dust. I gave the archivist the photograph of Evelyn. She studied it, adjusting her glasses. Then she shrugged and said something that didn't help me at all, that lots of women looked like this in the late 40s. Same hair, same dress style, same soft expression. She handed the photograph back and suggested I try the property records. She said old houses sometimes came with old stories, but finding them required patience and luck in equal measure. I thanked her and left feeling both discouraged and more curious than before. Back at home, I pulled up the property records online. My house had been built in 1953. The first owners were a couple with the last name Harper. They lived there for more than 20 years. Then the house changed hands twice in quick succession, first in the mid-70s and again in the early 80s. After that, it passed through a few more families until it eventually ended up with me. The Harper family seemed like the place to start. I wasn't sure how to find them, but I decided to check old newspapers. If the box belonged to them, or if they knew the people involved, maybe something had been written about them. That night, with a cup of hot tea beside me, I dug through digitized local newspapers, weddings, birth announcements, obituaries, community events where the Harper name popped up here and there, a PTA meeting, a church bake sale, a mention of Mr. Harper being recognized for his service in World War II. That last part made my pulse quicken a little. The medals in the box were military. The timeline fit. The handwriting looked like it belonged to someone who grew up in the era of fountain pens and handwritten letters. Could the box have belonged to Mr. Harper? I printed the article about him. It was small, just a paragraph, but it confirmed he'd served in the war. It didn't say where or in what capacity, but it was something. The next day, I drove to the public library. It was one of those old red brick libraries with tall windows and narrow aisles that felt like they belonged in a different decade. The local history room was in the back, tucked behind a row of maps and genealogy books. I found a binder labeled Harper Family. Inside were copies of obituaries, marriage notices, and census records. Mr. Harper had died in 1982. His wife had passed 4 years later. They had no children, no listed heirs. That explained why the house changed hands so suddenly after their deaths. But nothing in the binder mentioned Evelyn. I flipped page after page, newspaper clippings, marriage licenses, school rosters, no Evelyn. But at the back of the binder, I found something that made me stop. A photograph. It was taken in the early 1950s. A group of neighbors stood in front of my house, which looked nearly new in the picture. The Harpers stood in the center, smiling stiffly. A few neighbors stood around them, and there, on the far right, was a woman who looked exactly like the woman from the box. Her hair was styled differently. She stood a little older, but the face was unmistakable. It was Evelyn. She wasn't listed in the caption. She wasn't identified at all. Just another face in the crowd. But seeing her there, on the property, in front of the house where I'd found the box, made everything feel more real. She'd been there. She'd stood on that front lawn. She'd known the Harpers, or at least had been close enough to be included in a neighborhood photo. That night, I brought the photograph from the library home and compared it side by side with the one from the box. The resemblance wasn't coincidence. It was her. The same eyes, the same tilt of the chin, the same gentle expression that made you feel like she was thinking about something far beyond the moment. The pieces weren't fitting yet, but they were starting to touch. Over the next few days, I kept researching. The more I dug, the more I realized how many pieces of this story had been quietly scattered through time, waiting for someone to pick them up. I found no record of an Evelyn in the Harper household. No sister, no cousin, no long-term guest, nothing. But I found something else, a newspaper article from 1950 about a soldier returning home from Europe. The article mentioned him by name, James Harper. It described him as decorated for bravery. It mentioned he'd returned to a town whose streets he knew well. And it said something else too, that he returned to a woman he'd known before the war. It didn't name her, but the timing matched the age of the woman in the photograph. It made me wonder whether the medals in the box had been his, if the box had been hidden by him or someone close to him, if the letter in the box, with its regret and its unfinished promise, had been written by the same man who came back from Europe to a woman waiting for him on an Ohio street, and if that woman had been Evelyn. There were too many gaps, too many unanswered questions, but I could feel the story tightening around something important, something personal, something someone had wanted to hide or preserve. That week, I visited the county clerk's office. It was one of those buildings where the fluorescent lights buzzed and the old vinyl tiles were slightly curled at the edges. The clerk behind the desk pointed me toward the old marriage records. I scanned them slowly, page after page of cramped handwriting listing marriages from the 1940s and 50s. Eventually, I found a James Harper, but the bride wasn't Evelyn. It was a woman named Patricia. They'd married in 1947. If that was the same James Harper, and based on the dates, it had to be. It meant that if Evelyn was connected to him, it wasn't through marriage. And then, in one of the old newspapers I'd printed earlier, I found a small blurb. One line, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Local woman Evelyn Rose seen leaving town shortly after Mr. Harper's homecoming. No explanation, no follow-up. Just those few words, like a shadow lingering at the edge of someone else's story. It made me wonder whether the letter in the box had been meant for her, whether James had written it, whether something had happened between them that no one ever talked about, and whether the box hidden under my floorboards had been sealed away to keep that story buried. But the truth was, I was still missing too many pieces, and the story felt far from complete. A few days later, determined to learn more, I drove to a nursing home on the other side of town. Someone at the Historical Society had mentioned that one of the Harper family's distant relatives still lived there, an elderly woman who'd grown up on the same street. She'd been a child when the Harpers lived in the house. She was 91. I didn't know what I expected to find, or if she'd remember anything useful. But something in me felt like I needed to try. I signed in at the front desk, walked down the quiet hallway lined with soft yellow paint, and found her sitting in a recliner near the window, watching the snow fall outside. When I sat beside her and told her the address of my house, her expression changed. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, her eyes sharpened in a way I didn't expect. Even after all those decades, she remembered the house. She couldn't remember every detail about the Harpers, but she remembered something else. Something that made my chest tighten. She remembered the woman who used to visit them. A beautiful woman with dark curls. A woman who stood apart from the neighbors, always watching, always waiting for someone. A woman who used to sit on the porch with Mrs. Harper, talking quietly while Mr. Harper avoided coming outside when she was there. A woman named Evelyn. She told me that Evelyn stopped coming one summer. No one knew why. No one talked about it. And not long after that, the Harpers changed, as she put it. She didn't know what that meant exactly, only that the Harpers became more withdrawn, less social, more guarded. I thanked her gently and left the nursing home feeling like I was holding someone else's past in my hands. The box, the letter, the medals, the photograph, the newspaper blurb, the sudden disappearance. The story was starting to come together, but it was missing its center, like a puzzle with the most important piece gone. That weekend, I returned to the floorboard cavity, hoping I'd missed something. Maybe another clue, maybe another box, maybe something smaller tucked into the corner. I lowered myself onto my knees and ran my hand along the edges of the cavity. My fingers brushed against something rough, a torn scrap of paper wedged between the joist and the subfloor. I pulled it out gently. It was brittle, yellowed, almost disintegrating between my fingers. On it were just 3 words, written in the same handwriting as the letter. Not her choice. My hands shook a little as I held it. That one sentence carried a weight I didn't want to imagine. Whatever had happened to Evelyn, whatever had been buried under those floorboards, whatever promise the writer believed he kept, it wasn't a simple love story. It wasn't a clean ending. It wasn't even entirely voluntary. The truth, whatever it was, had been buried on purpose. And now I had to decide whether I was willing to keep digging. For the next few days, the phrase on that torn scrap of paper wouldn't leave my mind. I kept hearing it, almost like a whisper in the back of my head, every time I walked through the house. Not her choice. It echoed in the bedroom when I passed the spot where the box had been hidden. It echoed through the kitchen when I made coffee in the morning. It followed me into the hallway and into sleep, turning into vague, unsettling dreams. The more I sat with those 3 words, the more I realized how many directions they could point. They could mean sadness. They could mean sacrifice. They could mean secrecy. Or they could mean something darker, something no one had wanted written in a letter or spoken aloud. Whatever had happened to Evelyn, she hadn't chosen it. That thought stayed with me. A few days later, I decided to look closer at the medals. I'd left them inside the box, but something felt different now that I knew more about the Harper family. I took them out carefully and cleaned the metal just enough to make out small manufacturer marks on the back creases. Standard military issue, mid-1940s. The Purple Heart struck me most. Someone had been wounded. Someone had lived through something violent, painful, traumatic. Hidden medals, hidden letters, hidden women. It all felt like pieces of a larger truth the house had been guarding. I reached out to a local veterans group to see if they had old records, but privacy rules were strict. They couldn't tell me much about any individual without proof I was next of kin. I wasn't. I was just a stranger with a box that didn't belong to me. Still, one of the volunteers offered a suggestion. He told me that many Y2 veterans' service records were lost in the 1973 National Archives fire in St. Louis. It meant that tracing someone's military history could be difficult or even impossible. That felt symbolic somehow. Another part of the story burned away, another missing link, another silence that could never fully be filled. But I wasn't ready to stop. If official records wouldn't help, maybe local memories would. In a town as old as mine, some stories lived longer in people's minds than in newspapers. I started visiting antique shops and talking to the older residents who sometimes sat near the counter, chatting about the past. Most didn't know the Harpers personally. But one woman remembered a story her mother used to tell, something about a young woman in the neighborhood who disappeared suddenly in the early 1950s. A woman who had been close to a married man. Nothing scandalous ever confirmed, but the kind of thing that grew quiet only when someone looked too closely. It wasn't proof, but it wasn't nothing. The more I learned about Evelyn, the more she began to feel familiar. Like someone I might have known if life had arranged itself differently. Someone who had walked the same floors, stood under the same ceiling, looked out the same windows. She had breathed the same space I lived in now, and the house remembered her. I kept the photograph of her near my desk. Every time I glanced at it, the expression on her face seemed to shift. Sometimes she looked hopeful, sometimes lost, sometimes defiant, sometimes resigned. The photograph felt alive, like it waited for me to understand something it couldn't say. One evening, as a storm rolled across the Ohio River and thunder shook the windows, I opened the letter again. The ink had faded in some places, but the emotions behind the words felt strong even after all the years they'd been hidden. A promise, regret, an admission of failure, a desire to make something right. But the letter didn't explain what had happened or why. It only hinted at something bigger, something unresolved. I found myself wondering why the letter had never been delivered, why someone had sealed it in a box, why they'd felt the need to bury that box in the floor rather than destroy it. People don't hide things without reason. The next morning, I returned to the Historical Society. The archivist recognized me immediately, gave a small, patient smile, and told me she'd found something I might want to see. She handed me a file containing clippings from local newspapers in the early 1950s. Most were ordinary: church gatherings, neighborhood picnics, school events. But one article made me stop. It was a missing person report from 1951. A small column with a grainy photo of a young woman who looked almost exactly like the Evelyn in my photograph. The name printed below the image confirmed it. The article said she was last seen leaving a general store downtown. The description noted her hair, her height, and the blue dress she'd been wearing. It mentioned she'd planned to catch a bus, but no one remembered seeing her at the station. There were no follow-up articles, no later updates, no resolution. It was as if she'd stepped out of her life and disappeared into thin air. The archivist mentioned something else, too. She told me that in the 1950s, if a grown woman left town, people often assumed she'd moved for a job, or marriage, or family reasons. Missing women weren't always investigated unless a crime was suspected. Sometimes newspapers printed a short announcement, and that was it. The past didn't always preserve the truth. Sometimes it buried it. I took a copy of the clipping and drove back home feeling heavy with the weight of someone else's unfinished life. That night, I stood in the bedroom where I'd found the box. The floorboard was still loose, leaning upright against the wall where I'd placed it days earlier. The cavity beneath it yawned open like an unhealed wound. I stared into it, imagining someone kneeling there decades earlier, placing the box inside with shaking hands. I tried to picture the emotions involved: fear, guilt, sorrow, love, desperation. Whatever they felt, it had been strong enough to make them hide the evidence of their feelings where no one was meant to find it. But time had other plans. The next morning, I took the photograph of Evelyn and drove to the county recorder's office. An employee helped me search property transfers from the 1940s and 50s. It was tedious, page after page of heavy books with handwritten entries. My eyes blurred after hours of reading. But eventually, I found a name that made my heart stop for a moment. Evelyn had once owned a small house 3 streets away from mine. She'd bought it in 1949. She'd sold it 2 years later, 1951, the same year she disappeared. The transfer documents listed the buyer's name, a man who wasn't from our county. A name I didn't recognize, a name I couldn't connect to any other piece of the story yet, but it felt important. I drove to the address. The house was still standing, though barely. The paint peeled in strips, the porch sagged, the yard was wild. A rusted mailbox leaned sideways, hanging on by one screw. It looked like a house time had given up on. The kind of place people passed on their evening walk without noticing. I sat in my car, staring at it, imagining Evelyn unlocking the door, stepping inside, placing her purse on a table that no longer existed. I imagined her sitting by the window, looking out, waiting for someone to arrive, someone who might never have come. That night, back home, I opened the box again. I stared at the medals and wondered whether James Harper had loved Evelyn before marrying Patricia, or whether something had happened during the war that followed him home and pulled Evelyn into its shadow. People rarely hide things unless the truth hurts, and whatever truth lived inside that box had hurt deeply. A week later, still searching for answers, I found myself standing in the county morgue's record office. It wasn't a place I ever imagined visiting. The air felt cold, even with heating humming through the vents. The walls were lined with metal filing cabinets that held the silent stories of the county's forgotten. I asked for death records from the early 1950s. The clerk printed a list. I scanned through it, not sure what I hoped to find, or feared finding. I ran my finger down the page slowly. No Evelyn Rose, no woman matching her age, no unidentified remains. At first, the absence felt like another dead end. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. If Evelyn had left town, someone would have said so. If she'd died locally, there would be a record. If she'd moved, someone might have mentioned it. But there was nothing. Total silence. Sometimes the loudest part of a story is the part no one recorded. Later that day, I stopped by the nursing home again. The elderly woman who'd remembered the Harpers wasn't always lucid, but she had moments of clarity that surprised me. When I told her I'd learned that Evelyn once lived a few streets away, she nodded like she expected that. She told me she remembered seeing Evelyn walking down the street many evenings, as if she were waiting for someone to open a door. She remembered the Harpers' house always being quiet after she stopped visiting. She remembered Mrs. Harper seeming sadder, and she remembered Mr. Harper growing more withdrawn. She didn't know why. She didn't know what happened. She only knew that people in town used to whisper that something had changed that summer. I left with more emotion than information. It seemed that everyone who had known the truth had taken it with them into the ground. But the house still remembered. At home, I opened the letter a final time, and something clicked. The handwriting leaned sharply, almost feverishly, not like a calm confession, but like a last attempt to set something right. The phrases about regret, the mention of a promise kept, the apology that seemed too heavy for ordinary love. It didn't feel like a farewell from a man to a lover. It felt like guilt, and the handwritten scrap, not her choice, felt like a small corner torn off a much larger truth. The more I let myself consider it, the darker the possibilities became. And that was when the house made another sound. A soft creak from the hallway, a shift in the temperature, a faint draft brushing across the back of my neck. Old houses settle, breathe, and expand with weather. I knew that. But in that moment, it felt more like the house was nudging me, urging me to look deeper. So I did. I went back to the original cavity and searched the gap between the joists again, this time removing more of the surrounding boards. The wood groaned as if it had been undisturbed for decades. Dust floated up in small clouds. My flashlight beam cut through the dimness. And then I saw something, a small indentation carved into the joist. At first I thought it was just damage from tools, but as I looked closer, I realized it was intentional. Someone had carved initials into the wood. J.H. plus E.R., James Harper, Evelyn Rose, together, hidden, preserved in the darkness under the floor, where only someone willing to tear the house open would ever find it. It wasn't graffiti. It wasn't careless. The lines were deep, carved with force, with emotion. It felt like a confession. I knelt there for a long time, staring at the initials, feeling the house settle around me in the quiet winter air. Whatever had happened between them had been real. Whatever had happened to her had changed him. Whatever had been hidden with intention. And now the truth felt closer. But the heart of the story was still missing. I didn't know it yet, but the missing piece would find me in a place I least expected. And when it did, I would finally learn what really happened to Evelyn and why her story ended beneath the floorboards of my home. All through my childhood, I thought old houses were just buildings with peeling paint and stubborn windows. But after everything I uncovered, I started to believe they remember things. Maybe not in the way people remember, not consciously, not deliberately, but in the quiet settling of their foundations, in the way they hold heat in certain corners, or creak only when you walk past a particular hallway at night. Houses hold the imprint of the lives they sheltered, even long after those lives leave. And as I dug deeper into Evelyn's story, I realized this house had been waiting for someone to ask the questions everyone else avoided. It didn't give me all the answers at once. It made me earn them, inch by inch. The next step was the courthouse. County courthouses in small-town Ohio always feel a little stuck in time. The fluorescent lights flicker. The floor tiles are so old they've developed a shine that no amount of cleaning could produce. The hallways smell faintly of paper, dust, and the coffee the clerks keep reheating in the same microwave for decades. I took the elevator to the third floor, where old marriage records, probate files, and property deeds are stored in long metal drawers that squeal when pulled open. Each one holds thousands of forgotten stories, most mundane, some heartbreaking, some quietly extraordinary. I found the drawer labeled 1940-1960 marriages and pulled it open. It took less than 3 minutes to find what I was looking for. June 12, 1948. Evelyn Hart marries Raymond Archer. The accompanying application said her age was 19, his 24, but something was off immediately. Under occupation, Evelyn had written nothing. Raymond's handwriting filled both lines, his own and hers. It wasn't common in the 1940s for a woman not to fill her own line unless there was a reason. A signature missing in a marriage application tells a story of its own. The clerk noticed me staring, walked past, then paused as if reconsidering. In a small town, silence doesn't mean ignorance, it means caution. I asked if there were separate license notes, any attachments, anything else filed under the couple's names. The clerk hesitated, then pointed toward the basement archive. It wasn't a place they sent people often. But I must have had a look that suggested I wasn't leaving without trying. The basement archive felt like stepping into the underside of the town's memory. The air was cold, unnaturally still. Rows of metal shelving ran wall to wall, filled with cardboard boxes labeled by year. I found the 1948 shelf and began searching. The box I needed was wedged between two larger cases. Dust puffed out when I opened it. Inside were bundles of envelopes tied with brittle twine. There it was. Archer, Raymond and Hart, Evelyn, 1948-1951, 3 years of records. A life condensed to 2 inches of paperwork. At the top was something unexpected. Application for delayed birth certificate for a male child, January 1950, male child. But the census record said their child was a girl. Even stranger, the father's signature was present, but the mother's signature line was crossed out with a single thin line. No explanation. Then a note. Mother, unable to appear. Father attests to information. My stomach tightened. I flipped through more documents. Household assessments. A tax verification from 1951. Then one page that stopped me cold. Death record. Infant Archer, February 3, 1950. Male, age 6 weeks. Cause of death, pneumonia. Burial location, County Poor Farm Cemetery. But I'd seen the census document with my own eyes. The 1950 census listed their child as female, age 1. And Evelyn was listed as alive, which meant 2 things were already wrong. The census wasn't matching the county records, or the family deliberately gave false information. I realized I needed to understand Raymond. Old newspapers are like time machines. Every small tragedy, every triumph, every scandal leaves a trace. I went through the microfilm reels at the county library. The librarian looked relieved to see someone under 50 using them. I searched Archer. I searched Hart. I searched the years around the infant's death. It took an hour before I found a small article tucked into the corner of a 1950 local paper. Local man returns alone from hospital trip. It said, Mr. Raymond Archer returned from the state hospital after a brief stay, citing exhaustion and stress following the illness of his newborn son. The rest was vague, but something about the phrasing stood out. The state hospital at that time wasn't a physical hospital. It was a psychiatric institution, a place where families sent people not just for illness, but for grief they didn't know how to handle. But why had Evelyn not returned with him? Why had she vanished from the census records after 1950? And if their son died, who was the little girl listed as their child? I felt like I had been handed 5 pieces from 3 different puzzles. The librarian offered one more clue without realizing it. She mentioned there had once been a community newsletter run by a local church in the 1940s and 1950s. It wasn't part of the newspaper archive, but she had a box of donated issues in a back room. I followed her through a narrow hallway to a room filled with donated books and boxes stacked knee-high. She dug through 2 stacks before finding what she meant. a battered box labeled First Methodist Circular, 1946-1960. She pulled it down, blew dust off the lid, and handed it to me. Inside were dozens of thin paper newsletters, birth announcements, prayer requests, community updates, the small, intimate pieces of a town's life. I combed through them year by year, and then I saw her name. Prayers requested for Mrs. Evelyn Archer, who remains under long-term care at the state hospital. Husband requests privacy during this difficult time. March 1950. She was in the same institution where Raymond had briefly stayed, but his release had been temporary. Hers wasn't. A second note, dated a year later, said, Evelyn remains in delicate condition and in need of continued prayers for peace and recovery. Delicate condition. In the 1950s, that phrase could mean almost anything. Postpartum depression, shock, grief, exhaustion, or situations no one at the time had the vocabulary or compassion to address properly. But what haunted me was the next part. Child now under care of extended family out of state. Child. Not children. Not plural, just child. A daughter. So the census hadn't made a mistake, but the county birth records had no daughter born to them, which meant the daughter wasn't theirs biologically, or she wasn't recorded properly, or she wasn't supposed to exist publicly. There was a story here, one no one had wanted to write down. I drove home that evening with my mind running in circles. The sun was setting over the fields, turning everything orange and then purple. The air had that crisp edge early spring brings in Ohio, the kind that makes the world feel both sharp and fragile. When I stepped back into my house, it felt different. Not ominous, not haunted, but aware. Like it knew I had taken another step toward understanding what it had protected all these years. I set the documents on the table beside the metal box and stared at them. A dead infant son. A daughter whose origins didn't match the records. A mother institutionalized indefinitely. A father unraveling. And somewhere between all that, a box hidden under my floorboards containing medals, a letter about a promise kept, and a photograph of a woman who looked like she carried the world in her eyes. I realized something then. Whoever hid that box didn't do it for themselves. They did it for someone yet to come, someone who might open it when the time was right, someone who might finally connect the pieces. The next morning, I went looking for the daughter. Her name wasn't listed anywhere in the county records because she wasn't born there. She was only mentioned in that one church circular as being under care of extended family out of state. Out of state. Which one? I used everything I'd found so far to create a profile. Date ranges, possible last names, likely locations, and eventually, through a combination of old phone directories, ancestry matches, and sheer determination, I found a name that matched every clue. A woman in her 70s, living in Indiana. Her name was Margaret. Margaret Archer, but Archer through adoption, not birth. I wasn't sure if I should reach out. It felt intrusive, maybe even cruel, disturbing someone with memories they might have spent a lifetime burying. But then I remembered the letter in the box. If you ever find this, tell her I kept my promise. Who was the promise for? And who was her? Evelyn? Margaret? Someone else entirely? If I walked away now, I would never know. And maybe this story wasn't just about the past. Maybe it was meant for the people still living, people who deserved to know the truth about who they were. So I picked up the phone. I called the number I had found. And when the line connected, when a soft, elderly voice answered, I realized the story I had uncovered wasn't nearly finished. It was only beginning. I've always believed that some phone calls split your life into two parts: the person you were before you made the call and the person you were afterward. And as I sat at my kitchen table that morning with the number typed into my phone but not yet dialed, I could feel that split coming. It hovered like a weightless line in the air, the kind you could step over or walk away from. I hesitated for a long moment, staring at the digits glowing on the screen, wondering if I was crossing into something that wasn't mine to disturb. But that box under the floorboards hadn't been hidden accidentally. Nothing about it felt random. Someone once chose that place deliberately, sealing away a story they couldn't carry anymore. And now that story had slipped into my hands like a responsibility I hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. So I pressed the call button. The phone rang twice, then again, and then an older woman's voice answered, thin but steady. The kind of voice that had weathered decades and still carried something gentle in it. She said hello with a caution that felt familiar somehow. That carefulness older people use when they're not sure if the voice on the other end will bring good news, bad news, or just a wrong number. I introduced myself in the simplest way possible, giving only my name and saying that I was researching a home's history in Ohio and had come across something that might relate to her family. I spoke slowly, choosing each word with care, avoiding saying anything that might sound like an accusation, a revelation, or a wound. I kept it factual, neutral. Her tone changed almost immediately, not warmer exactly, but alert, like she'd straightened in her chair. She didn't speak much. She didn't ask who I was beyond the basics. She didn't rush to fill the silence. She listened. And I could sense, even through the phone, that listening was something she'd spent a lifetime learning to do. When the call ended, she didn't brush me off. She didn't hang up quickly. She simply said that she would need some time to think, and that she appreciated the care I'd taken in reaching out. There was something in the way she said it, as if she'd heard a kind of truth she wasn't ready to face but couldn't entirely turn away from. And then the line went silent. I lowered the phone, set it on the table, and felt the weight of the moment settle into my chest. There was no going back now. I had set something in motion, not dramatic, not explosive, just a small shift in the world that would eventually ripple further than I could see. The next few weeks passed slowly. I kept the box on my nightstand, unable to tuck it back under the floorboards. Sometimes at night, when the house was quiet and the winter wind pushed against the siding, I would lift the photograph of Evelyn and study her expression again and again. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't sad. She looked like someone suspended between choices she didn't fully understand, someone who had tasted a life that was slipping out of reach. The more I stared, the more it felt like she was watching something just over my shoulder, something invisible to me. I wondered what she had seen that day. I wondered what she had feared. I wondered what she had hoped for, even when hope must have felt like a fragile thing. I also wondered who had taken the photograph. The angle was intimate enough that it might have been someone she trusted, maybe the same person who'd written the letter, someone who had made a promise, one they believed they'd kept, even if the world had disagreed. I tried searching for images of Raymond, but none turned up in archives. Men didn't take many photos then. Women kept them, tucked in drawers, slid into Bibles, taped behind mirrors. If Evelyn had kept photos, they were gone now, lost with her absence, buried with her silence, stored in some forgotten box the way her story had been stored under my floorboards. But the house itself, my house, felt more alive now, almost restless. When I walked through the hallway, the floor seemed to creak in patterns I hadn't noticed before, like it was reminding me where to look, where the weight of the past had once lingered. I started paying attention to the corners of the rooms, places where paint was thicker from old touch-ups, places where wallpaper had been stripped, places where the plaster bulged slightly the way it does when someone patched a hole too quickly. It was as though the walls were whispering, "Look here, look again, there's more." And there was. A storm revealed the next clue. Late one night in early March, heavy winds swept through the neighborhood, rattling the windows so hard they sounded like they might shatter. I stayed awake, listening to the wind push itself through the branches of the bare maple tree outside, listening to the gutters groan under cold rain. When the power flickered and finally went out, the entire house plunged into a kind of thick, quiet darkness that felt older than the storm itself. I lit a candle and walked through the living room toward the back hall. Just before I reached the small linen closet, I heard something, a faint rattling from behind the wall. Not pipes, not the wind, something different, almost like a loose board shifting in a place where nothing should have been loose. I set the candle on the floor and pressed my ear to the wall. The sound came again, subtle but distinct. A hollow knock, almost imperceptible, like something behind the wall had moved ever so slightly in the sudden cold. I tapped the wall with my knuckles. It sounded consistent everywhere except for one small section near the baseboard, where the sound softened, deepened, became almost a muted echo. Old houses are filled with voids, crawl spaces, blocked-off vents, hollows left behind from renovations nobody documented. But this felt purposeful, deliberate. When the storm finally eased and morning came, I took a small pry bar and carefully removed the baseboard. Behind it was plaster, cracked, uneven, not original. It took time, but I chipped away small sections until I uncovered what lay behind. A cavity. And inside that cavity, wrapped in cloth stiffened by dust and time, was a notebook. Not a diary, not a ledger, something in between. The cover was dark brown, possibly once leather but now dry and fragile. The pages were filled with small slanted handwriting that matched the letter from the box. The same urgency, the same tension in the strokes. But this was longer, much longer, maybe 100 pages or more. The first entry wasn't dated. It was written in long paragraphs with no breaks, as though whoever wrote it had been afraid that if they stopped for a breath, they might lose their nerve. And the very first sentence made my hand tremble as I held the notebook under the pale morning light. If anyone ever finds this, please know that I never meant for her to be forgotten. Her, the same word from the letter, the same unnamed presence in every clue, the same figure whose existence was threaded invisibly through the records, the inconsistencies, the quiet grief of all the documents left behind. Her. Evelyn? Margaret? Someone else entirely? I read the next line, then the next. And with each line, I felt my breath tighten. The notebook didn't read like a confession or a memoir. It read like a warning. A truth someone wasn't allowed to speak aloud but couldn't bear to let disappear. And the deeper I read, the clearer it became. This story wasn't about one woman. It wasn't about one child. It wasn't even about the Archer family. It was about a choice someone made long ago, a choice that had changed the course of more than one life. And now, decades later, the house had decided it was time for someone to finally understand what had been lost and what had been saved. The first pages of the notebook read almost like someone talking to themselves at a time when silence felt dangerous. The handwriting shifted slightly from page to page, sometimes shakier, sometimes steadier. The way a person's hand changes when they are tired or frightened or living under the weight of something they cannot say aloud. As I read, it became clear that this notebook wasn't meant to be found in the writer's lifetime. It was written the way people write things they know they'll have to hide. The entries were not dated, but patterns emerged. The writer described days where the light lasted longer than expected, days where the cold crept into the bones of the house, days where sleepless nights stretched into morning. It wasn't difficult to guess that these were the years after the war, possibly the late 1940s, maybe early 1950s. The writer mentioned rationed goods still being in the stores, the way people continued talking about the men returning, and the strange awkwardness of a country learning how to feel normal again. One paragraph described the kitchen of my house so vividly that I looked up from the notebook to make sure the room hadn't subtly changed around me. The writer described the way the late afternoon light hit the sink and reflected toward the table, forming a narrow ribbon of brightness across the floor. They described the sound the back door made when the wind pushed against it, the same soft rattle I'd heard a dozen times since moving in. They described the squeak of the hallway floorboard outside the bedroom, the crookedness of the doorframe that leaned a little to the left, the way the house settled sharply whenever the temperature dropped. They were describing my home as it had been 70 years earlier, But some details hadn't changed. The bones of the place were the same. The creaks were the same. It made the house feel even older, as if its memory ran deeper than anything written on paper. But the notebook wasn't about the house. Not really. It was about someone the writer referred to only as her, a presence that hovered in every entry without ever being fully named. At first, I thought her meant Evelyn. It made sense. The photo, the letter, the hidden box. But the more I read, the more I sensed that the writer and Evelyn were not the same person. There were too many references to watching her from a distance. Too many moments where the writer described not knowing how to approach her. Too many passages heavy with guilt about something they had done or failed to do. The writer described Evelyn as if she were a light inside a space of shadows, a person who carried her own quiet sadness, but also a kind of strength that others leaned on. They described the way she moved through the house during the last weeks of her pregnancy. They described the way she hummed to herself early in the mornings, the way she sat by the window reading the newspaper even when there wasn't much in it to read, the way she touched her growing belly with a mixture of fear and tenderness. But then the entries shifted. They became darker. The notebook described the night the infant boy, the one recorded as having died at 6 weeks old, first showed signs of illness. It described the sense of dread in the house as he struggled to breathe. It described the moment when their small world began to unravel, thread by fragile thread. The writer described sitting in the hallway, listening to Evelyn cry in the bedroom, unable to find the strength to go to her or to leave her alone. And then the notebook became even harder to read. The writer described the baby's death not as a single moment, but as a series of moments too quiet for the world to notice, but too loud for the heart to hold. The writer described the silence afterward, how heavy it was, how unnatural, how it filled every room like fog. There was a line that stopped me completely. A line about how a house can feel emptier with the loss of one tiny breath than with the loss of all its furniture. I put the notebook down for a moment then, feeling the air around me tighten. I didn't know the people in the story, but grief is universal, and the way the writer described it made me feel as though their sorrow had soaked into the walls and stayed there, waiting for someone willing to touch it. The next entries shifted again. The writer began to write about Evelyn withdrawing, not suddenly, but slowly, like a fading photograph. She stopped humming in the mornings. She avoided the window. She stopped touching the small objects around the house that had once given her comfort. The writer described trying to reach her, trying to sit with her, trying to remind her she was not alone, and failing. Every attempt seemed to slip through a space between them the writer couldn't cross. There was a line, halfway down a page, that stayed with me long after I closed the notebook that first night. It was the kind of grief that hardens into silence before anyone realizes they should have listened more closely. I felt a chill reading it, not because of any supernatural implication, but because it sounded like the quiet truth so many people learn too late. But the writer wasn't just chronicling grief. They were circling something larger, a choice, a turning point, a reckoning they hadn't fully admitted aloud. And then, near the middle of the notebook, everything shifted. The writing became frantic, the lines uneven, the ink darker as if the pen had been pressed too hard. The entry described a night when someone else arrived at the house, a woman from what the writer called the county board. That phrasing alone told me what era this was. During the 1940s and 1950s, county social boards often intervened when families struggled, especially after tragedies. They didn't always intervene gently. The writer described the meeting in fragmented emotional terms. The county woman spoke in soft tones that didn't match the severity of what she was explaining. She talked about Evelyn's condition. She talked about Raymond's instability. She talked about the best interest of a child, not the child who had died, the girl who appeared in the census but not in the birth records. The girl the county woman insisted must be relocated temporarily while the home stabilized. The The writer described sitting frozen, unable to protest, unable to reach for the little girl who had been napping in the next room, unable to find the strength to say no. The entry ended with a sentence that trembled across the page. I stood there and let them take her. I stopped reading for a long moment after that, because now the outlines were filling in. Now the pieces were starting to make terrible, clear sense. Margaret, the woman I had called, the woman whose quiet voice had steadied itself when I mentioned the house, hadn't been placed with extended family by choice. She had been taken by the county, given to distant relatives or a foster home, moved out of state to avoid community questions, and raised with a history rewritten for her. And the notebook wasn't written by Evelyn. It wasn't written by Raymond. It was written by someone else in the house, someone who had been present for all of it, someone who lived with the guilt so deeply that they hid their words behind a wall, someone who had made the promise in the letter, the promise I still didn't fully understand. When I turned the page, the next entry began in a calmer hand, but the pain beneath it was unmistakable. The writer described going to the county office repeatedly, trying to ask questions in indirect ways because they feared being labeled unfit. They described writing letters that were never answered. They described walking past the empty bedroom and forcing themselves to shut the door because seeing it open was too painful. But the most heartbreaking part came near the end of the notebook, written in tiny, tight handwriting as though the writer didn't want anyone to hear the thoughts even on paper. I made a promise that I would bring her home, and though I cannot do that in this life, I will not let her be erased. It was the closest thing to a confession I'd ever read, and it was the first moment I realized that the story I had stepped into was not only about uncovering the truth, it was about someone, decades ago, trying desperately to leave the truth behind for someone, anyone, to find. They couldn't save Evelyn. They couldn't save the boy. They couldn't save the girl, but they could save the story. They could hide it in the house. They could trust that someday someone would come along who cared enough to unbury it. And now here I was, holding their words in my hands, feeling the weight of what they had left behind. I didn't plan on going back to the attic that morning. I thought I had found everything worth finding. The diary, the photographs, the neatly folded papers that had waited decades for someone to care. I'd already pieced together more than most people ever learn about the strangers who lived in their home before them. But something kept tugging at me. Not a voice, not a thought, just a tightness in my chest, the lingering sense that the story still wasn't complete. There are stories that close themselves, and there are stories that refuse to be done until every truth has surfaced. This one wasn't finished with me yet. The house was quiet when I pulled down the attic ladder again. The same smell of dust and old cedar drifted out, and I climbed into the dimness, feeling the dry air settle around me. The light bulb hummed when I switched it on. There was nothing new up there, not at first glance. The same boxes, the same heavy trunks, the same silence. But I realized I had never gone through the trunk in the corner. The one with the cracked leather handle and the rusted latch that had resisted me the first time I tried. Something about it had felt too personal then, too heavy with someone else's grief. But now I knew enough to understand that whoever placed the diary where I found it had intentions. He hadn't left things randomly. He'd arranged them, guided them. So I returned to the trunk. The latch fought me again. I pressed my thumb against it, felt the metal dig into my skin, and heard a soft snap as it finally gave way. The lid groaned when I pushed it upward, releasing a breath of stale air trapped for decades. Inside was nothing dramatic, just a stack of notebooks, loose papers tied with twine, and a single wooden box smaller than the one I'd found behind the floorboards. This one was scratched and worn, the varnish stripped in places where fingers had rubbed over it for years. Whoever owned it must have held it often. I lifted the box carefully. It wasn't locked. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, yellowed and thin, like it had been opened and closed more times than anyone could count. I unfolded it gently, afraid it might tear from age. The handwriting wasn't Evelyn's. It wasn't Raymond's either. It was his. The author of the diary. The one whose voice had carried me through their heartbreak without ever revealing his name. The page wasn't a confession. It wasn't a retelling. It was something quieter, almost like a letter he never sent, addressed not to anyone specific, but to the future itself. A message he wrote because he feared the truth would otherwise disappear with him. And finally, I learned who he was. He wasn't a neighbor or a friend or a distant observer. He was family. He was Evelyn's brother. His name was Thomas Ward. The realization made something in the story shift sharply into focus. It explained the tenderness with which he wrote about her, the pain he carried like a weight inside him, the guilt he couldn't shake. He wasn't chronicling a tragedy. He was preserving the truth because he was part of it. The letter explained things the diary never openly stated, things too painful to place inside the pages he meant for someone else to read someday. He wrote that he had been there the night Evelyn ran. He had heard Raymond shouting. He had seen the bruises forming. He had known, long before she ever admitted it, the danger she lived with. He had tried to convince her to leave dozens of times, but she always said the same thing. She had nowhere to go. But the night she ran, she had come to him. Thomas wrote that she arrived at his door after midnight, shaking so hard she couldn't speak. She had a single suitcase with her, and the baby wrapped tight against her chest. He realized immediately that something irreversible had happened, something that meant she couldn't go back. He didn't ask questions. He just let her in. He kept her hidden for weeks, fed her, helped her plan her next steps, watched her try to be a mother while living in constant fear that Raymond would find her. And he loved her. Of course he did. Not romantically, but fiercely, as only a brother can love a sister who's been hurt too deeply for words. But then came the night the officials arrived, the night she broke, the night the child was taken. Thomas didn't describe the details in the letter, maybe because writing them down was too painful, but he did write about the aftermath, how Evelyn didn't speak for days, how she walked the house like a ghost, hollow and unreachable, how she kept touching her hands as if searching for the weight of her daughter that used to rest there. Raymond wasn't the one who raised the child. The state didn't give her back to him. She disappeared into the system, placed with a family states away. And Evelyn shattered. Thomas wrote that he tried everything to keep her together. He begged her to stay with him. He offered to find lawyers, investigators, anyone who might help. But grief that deep doesn't listen. It only consumes. And soon after losing her daughter, Evelyn left Ohio entirely. She boarded a bus heading west and didn't tell anyone where she was going. Years later, a postcard arrived with no return address, just a brief message saying she was alive. That was the last he heard. The letter ended with something that made my heart tighten. I write this because stories vanish when the ones who carry them leave the world. Someone must know what happened. Someone must remember her, not as a tragedy, but as a girl who tried, as a sister who deserved more time. If you find this, whoever you are, please do not let her disappear. I sat there in the attic with that thin, trembling paper in my hands and realized something I should have understood all along. Thomas meant for someone to find this. He hid the diary behind the floorboards because that was where Evelyn had hidden her daughter's things. As if placing the truth near the remnants of that child's short time with her was the only respectful thing he could do. He left the wooden box in the trunk with his letter because part of him still hoped someone, anyone, would care enough to look deeper. He had carried the burden of his sister's story his entire life, and in the end, all he wanted was for someone else not to let it die with him. Sitting there in the silence, surrounded by dust and memory and the soft hum of the old attic bulb, I felt something settle over me. Not fear, not sadness, but responsibility. Thomas had preserved the truth across decades. Now it was mine. And as I folded the letter back into the box, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a story about a lost child or a broken marriage or the cruelty of a system that thought it was helping. This was a story about a man who loved his sister so deeply that he spent his life protecting the only thing she left behind, her truth. And I knew, even before the final piece revealed itself, that the ending would not be simple. Because stories like this never end simply, but they do end honestly. And the final truth, the one Thomas couldn't bring himself to write, was still waiting somewhere in this house, waiting for me. I didn't go back into the attic for a few days after finding Thomas's letter. It felt wrong, almost disrespectful, to rush into the next revelation as if I were flipping pages in someone else's private book. There was weight in what he had written, grief that had settled into the old floorboards of this house long before I ever stepped inside. A story that had been waiting so patiently that barging through it felt like a kind of violence. But time has a way of pushing you forward, even when you're not ready, and some truths don't sit quietly once you've approached them. They begin tugging at you from corners of your thoughts, tapping gently against your mind until you finally give in and follow where they lead. So I returned to the attic, not because I wanted another discovery, but because the house felt unfinished. It was almost as if it exhaled when I pulled the ladder down, as if it had been waiting. This time, I didn't go to the trunk. I walked past it, past the stacks of boxes, past the old sewing machine and the crates filled with newspapers that had yellowed down to brittle curls. Something, instinct, intuition, or maybe just the strange sense of alignment that comes when you're finally on the right path, pulled me toward the farthest corner of the attic, a place I hadn't noticed before. The boards looked slightly different there, a little newer, but still old, replaced at some point maybe. But what made them stand out wasn't their condition. It was the faint outline of a rectangle. A square of wood cut cleanly into the floor, sitting just slightly higher on one edge, like someone had lifted it once and then set it back down imperfectly. A hidden compartment. I knelt carefully, the wood creaking beneath my knees. My fingers slid along the edge until they found the slight indentation where the board could be lifted. It didn't take much force. The panel rose easily, almost willingly, revealing a narrow space between joists. Inside were only two things: a small, cloth-bound book, and a thin envelope that looked as though it had been opened and closed more times than its aging paper should have allowed. I reached for the envelope first. The paper was so fragile, I feared it might crumble. There was no name on the front, no address, just blank, worn parchment. Inside was a single sheet, folded many times over. My breath caught when I saw the handwriting. It wasn't Evelyn's. It wasn't Thomas's. It wasn't Raymond's. It was a stranger's. A name was written at the top in shaky, uncertain letters, the kind a young person writes when they're trying to imitate adulthood. A name that didn't appear in any of the documents I'd found. A name that had never been spoken in any pages, any entries, any testimony of those years. The daughter's name. I felt a chill slip down my spine. It was her handwriting, the child Evelyn carried, the child the state took, the child who vanished into the system. She grew up, she learned to write, and at some point she began searching. The letter wasn't long, but it carried the weight of decades. She wrote that she had always felt displaced, always felt something missing, that her adoptive parents had loved her, but could never answer the question that gnawed at her ribs like hunger. She wrote that she'd found documents, partial ones, confusing ones, that suggested she was born somewhere else, to someone else, that she'd spent most of her teenage years trying to find the truth and failing. She wrote that she had become an adult, still searching. The letter ended abruptly, with a sentence that wasn't finished, as if she had been interrupted, or overwhelmed, or uncertain how to continue. But the final line she managed to write stopped me cold. If anyone ever finds this, I want you to know I tried to find her. I tried to find where I came from. I just don't know if I'm too late. Too late for what? Too late to meet Evelyn? Too late to learn the truth? Too late to understand who she was? Or too late to keep looking? I didn't know. The envelope held no dates, no clear markers of time, but the paper felt newer than the letters Thomas had written. Maybe from the 1990s, maybe early 2000s. Hard to say, but not ancient, not decades old. She had been here. She had stood in this attic. Maybe searching the same way I was. Maybe hoping her mother had left something behind. Maybe praying for answers that the world had denied her for so long. And suddenly, I understood something with absolute clarity. Thomas hadn't hidden this compartment from the world. He had created it for her, for Evelyn's daughter, the child he loved but never met, the one he hoped would one day walk through this house, searching for the truth. The diary had been hidden because it was Evelyn's story. The letter in the trunk was Thomas's own burden. But this compartment, this small private space, felt like something more delicate than all of that. It was the intersection, the place where three lives met without ever being in the same room. I finally picked up the cloth-bound book. It wasn't a diary. It wasn't a journal. It was a notebook filled with notes, names, possible addresses, scraps of information gathered like a mosaic of breadcrumbs, half-formed leads, counties, foster system records, dates circled, pages torn out, as if she had second-guessed her own theories, and near the back, several pages were left blank, except for one, a page with a list of addresses. One of them was mine. My breath caught sharply. Not the house I grew up in, not a house I had ever lived in before, but this one, the house I live in now. She had written it down. She had circled it. She had put an arrow beside it with a question mark. She had come close, so close that it almost hurt to imagine. She found the address. She found the house. She found the attic. She found this compartment. And she left the letter behind. Maybe for Thomas, maybe for Evelyn, maybe for anyone who might someday care enough to continue where she stopped. But she didn't take the diary. She didn't take the letters. She didn't take the photographs. Maybe she didn't know how they fit together. Maybe she was scared of what she'd find. Maybe she left in a hurry. Or maybe she left because she couldn't face the possibility that her mother had died without ever knowing her. Whatever the reason, one thing was clear. She had been here. But she hadn't found the truth. Not all of it. Not enough. And now the truth belonged to me. Not because I was part of this family by blood, not because I had any right to it, but because I was the one who cared enough to look. I sat there for a long time with the notebook in my lap, the letter beside me, and the dust floating softly through beams of attic light. It felt like the house was holding its breath with me. And in that stillness, something settled over me. Not fear, not sadness, but clarity. I couldn't let the story end here. Not with a lost child's unfinished search, not with a brother's lifelong grief, not with Evelyn's hope buried under silence. Their story hadn't ended. It had simply been waiting. Someone needed to carry it forward. Someone needed to make sure the child who grew up searching wasn't searching alone. I didn't know where she was now. I didn't know if she was still alive. I didn't know if she ever found peace. But I knew one thing with certainty. I would find her if I could, or I would leave the truth somewhere she could find me. Because stories like this don't belong to the past. They belong to whoever is willing to hold them, to whoever chooses to remember. And as I lowered the attic board back into place, sealing the compartment gently, I realized something I hadn't understood before. This house had never been haunted. It had just been waiting. Waiting for someone to listen. Waiting for someone to notice. Waiting for someone to connect the final dots. Waiting for me. And now that I finally understood what it had been trying to offer, I wasn't going to let the truth disappear again.